Good evening, friends. Tonight we'll drift into a slow and gentle journey through Norse myths and ancient tales of trickery and wonder. Dim your lights, settle under your blanket, let the noise of the day fade away, and if this calm journey helps you relax, feel free to tap like and subscribe, only if it feels right. These are stories that have been whispered around fires for over 1,000 years. Tales of gods who weren't perfect, of bargains that went sideways, and of a horse unlike any other. You don't need to know anything about Norse mythology to enjoy these quiet moments. Just let the words wash over you like gentle waves. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is in your city right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Are you settling in for the night in Tokyo? Having a quiet afternoon in London? Maybe it's that peaceful hour just before dawn somewhere else entirely. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's begin. Picture this. You're sitting by a fire in ancient Scandinavia, and someone begins to tell you about the strangest horse that ever lived. Not strange because it was wild or beautiful, but because it had 8 legs. Yes, 8. And this wasn't just any horse. This was the horse that would carry the king of the gods across all the worlds. But every story has a beginning, and this one starts not with the horse, but with a problem. The gods had a problem. They lived in a place called Asgard, which you can think of as a city in the sky. Beautiful, yes, but completely unprotected. No walls, no gates, no fence to keep unwanted visitors out. Now, you might wonder, why didn't the gods just build a wall themselves? Well, gods, it turns out, aren't always practical. They were good at many things. Fighting, yes. Magic, certainly. But the day-to-day work of mixing mortar and stacking stones, that seemed beneath them. They had spent so much time on grand adventures and cosmic battles that the simple task of construction felt almost insulting. So there they sat, in their beautiful, unprotected city, wondering what to do. The wind would blow through Asgard unimpeded, carrying with it the sounds of other worlds. Sometimes those sounds were pleasant. The singing of elves, the distant laughter of children in Midgard, which we know as Earth. But sometimes, the sounds were less welcoming. The grumbling of giants, the scratching of things that preferred darkness to light. Odin, the king of the gods, would often stand at the edge of Asgard and look out into the vastness beyond. He had 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, whose names meant thought and memory. Each day they would fly out across all the worlds and return with news. And each day, that news reminded him that not everything out there was friendly. The giants especially were a concern, not because they were evil exactly, but because they were different. Where the gods valued order and beauty, giants often preferred chaos and change. Where the gods wanted things to stay the same, giants wanted to see what would happen if everything was turned upside down. It was like having neighbors who loved to rearrange your furniture while you slept, except your furniture was the fundamental forces of reality. So Odin would stand there, his blue cloak rippling in the cosmic wind, and think about walls. Not glamorous walls built of gold or silver or starlight, but practical walls, strong walls, boring walls that would do their job of keeping unwanted visitors out. The other gods had their own ways of dealing with the problem. Thor, Odin's son, preferred the direct approach. If giants come, he would say, hefting his mighty hammer, I'll simply knock them back where they came from. And he could too. Thor was strong enough to level mountains, and loud enough to make thunder jealous. But even Thor couldn't be everywhere at once, and hammer swinging was exhausting work. Frigg, Odin's wife, took a more diplomatic view. Perhaps we could negotiate, she would suggest. Offer them something they want in exchange for leaving us in peace. Frigg was wise and patient, the kind of person who could see 12 moves ahead in any conversation. But even she had to admit that giants weren't always interested in negotiation. And then there was Loki. Loki, if you've heard of Norse mythology at all, you've probably heard of Loki. He was complicated. Not a god, exactly, but not a god, either. He lived with the gods, ate at their table, called Odin his blood brother, but he was also part giant, which meant he understood both sides in ways that made everyone slightly uncomfortable. Loki had a different approach to the wall problem. He would pace around Asgard's perimeter, which was considerable, muttering to himself. Not the kind of muttering that meant he was crazy, but the kind that meant he was thinking, planning, calculating angles that no one else had considered. You see, Loki had a gift for finding solutions that no one else would think of. Not always good solutions, mind you, but certainly creative ones. While others saw problems, Loki saw opportunities. While others saw obstacles, Loki saw interesting puzzles to solve. The wall problem was particularly interesting to him, because it wasn't really about the wall at all. It was about time, and labor, and payment, and who owed what to whom. These were the kinds of abstract concepts that made Loki's eyes light up like candles in a dark room. So as autumn settled over the 9 worlds, and the leaves in Midgard turned colors that had no names, the gods of Asgard continued to debate their wall problem. They would gather in their great hall, Gladsheim, and discuss it over meals that lasted for hours. The conversations would meander like slow rivers, touching on everything from architecture to politics, to the price of good stone. Little did they know that their solution was already walking toward them across the vastness between worlds. It wore the shape of a man, but it was much larger than any man had ever been. It led a horse that was strong enough to move mountains, literally, and it carried tools that could carve through stone like it was soft butter. This stranger had heard about the gods' problem, the way news traveled in those days, carried on the wind, whispered by ravens, passed along by travelers who moved between the worlds, and he had an idea for a solution. A bargain, you might call it. The kind of deal that sounded reasonable when you first heard it, but got more complicated the longer you thought about it. But that's a story for another moment. For now, just imagine the gods in their beautiful, unprotected city, watching the horizon and wondering what tomorrow might bring. Imagine Odin with his ravens, Thor with his hammer, Frigg with her wisdom, and Loki with his plans within plans within plans. And somewhere out there in the space between worlds, imagine a builder and his horse, making their steady way toward a meeting that would change everything. What kind of bargain do you think a giant might propose to the gods? And what price would be worth paying for the perfect wall? Sometimes the most important visitors arrive quietly. You remember how the gods were sitting in their unprotected city, debating and discussing their wall problem. Well, while they talked, winter was walking toward them across all the worlds, and with winter came a stranger. He didn't announce himself with thunder or lightning. He didn't send messengers ahead, or demand an audience. He simply appeared one morning at the edge of Asgard, standing patiently like someone waiting for a bus that might or might not come. The first god to notice him was Heimdall, whose job it was to watch the rainbow bridge that connected Asgard to the other worlds. Heimdall had the sharpest eyes of anyone, divine or otherwise. He could see a leaf fall in Midgard from his post in Asgard. He could hear grass growing, which sounds like it would be annoying, but Heimdall found it peaceful. So when Heimdall saw the stranger, he saw him clearly, a man but larger than men usually were. Not giant-sized exactly, but definitely on the tall side of things. He wore simple clothes, the kind that working people wore. His hands were large and calloused, the hands of someone who had spent years gripping tools and lifting heavy things. Beside him stood a horse unlike any Heimdall had ever seen, not because it was beautiful, though it was. Not because it was large, though it certainly was that too. This horse looked like it could pull the world itself, if you hitched it to the right cart. Its coat was grey like storm clouds, and its eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost unsettling. Heimdall watched for a while, the way you might watch someone standing on your front porch, deciding whether they're selling something or just lost. The stranger didn't seem impatient. He didn't pace or fidget or check the position of the sun. He just stood there with his horse, occasionally patting its neck in the absent way that people do when they're thinking. Finally, Heimdall called out to him. "You there," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "State your business in Asgard." The stranger smiled, the kind of smile that was polite without being particularly warm. "I've come about the wall," he said. His voice was deep and measured, like someone who was used to talking over the sound of hammering and chiseling. Now, this was interesting. News of the god's wall problem had apparently traveled farther than they'd realized. Heimdall considered this for a moment. On one hand, uninvited visitors were always suspicious. On the other hand, they did need a wall, and this person certainly looked like he knew which end of a hammer to hold. "What about the wall?" Heimdall asked. "I can build it for you," the stranger replied. "The whole thing, strong enough to keep out anyone you don't want getting in, beautiful enough that you'll be proud to look at it every day." Heimdall thought about this. It sounded almost too good to be true, which in his experience usually meant it was, but he was curious enough to want to hear more. "Wait here," he told the stranger. "I'll let the others know you're here." So Heimdall went to find Odin, who was in his high seat, Halid's Gelf, from which he could see all the 9 worlds. Odin was having one of his thinking days. the kind where he would sit very still for hours, letting his mind wander across the cosmos, like his ravens wandered across the sky. "There's someone here about the wall," Heimdall said. Odin's attention snapped back to the present, like a rubber band. "Someone? What kind of someone?" "A builder, says he can solve our problem." Within the hour, all the gods had gathered to meet this mysterious visitor. They came with different attitudes. Thor came with suspicion, his hand never far from his hammer. Frigg came with curiosity, always interested in meeting new people. Loki came with what looked like casual interest. But if you knew Loki well, you might have noticed a particular sharpness in his attention. The stranger introduced himself simply. "I'm a builder," he said. "I specialize in walls, fortifications, the kind of construction that lasts forever." He gestured to his horse. "This is Svadilfari. He's my partner in this work. There's nothing he can't pull, no stone he can't move." The gods looked at Svadilfari with new interest. The horse was indeed impressive. His muscles moved under his grey coat like shifting landscapes. His hooves looked like they could crack granite, and probably had. "So," Odin said, settling into his diplomatic voice, "what exactly are you proposing?" The builder's proposal was straightforward. He would build them a wall around the entire perimeter of Asgard. Not just any wall, but a masterpiece of construction. It would be tall enough that giants couldn't climb over it, strong enough that they couldn't break through it, and beautiful enough that the gods would be proud to call it theirs. "How long would this take?" Frigg asked. She was always practical about timelines. "1 winter," the builder replied. "I'll start now, work through the cold months, and have it finished by the first day of spring." The gods exchanged glances. This was incredibly fast for such a massive project. The perimeter of Asgard was enormous. Building a wall around it should have taken years, not months. "And payment?" Odin asked, because even gods knew that nothing good came free. Here the builder paused, the way people do when they're about to ask for something significant. "I'd like 3 things," he said, "the sun, the moon, and the goddess Freyja as my wife." The silence that followed was the kind that makes everyone aware of their own breathing. The sun and moon weren't just pretty lights in the sky. They were fundamental forces that kept all the worlds functioning. And Freyja wasn't just any goddess. She was the goddess of love and beauty, keeper of the afterlife hall Sleipnir, and one of the most powerful beings in all the 9 worlds. In other words, he was asking for everything. Thor's hand moved to his hammer. "That's ridiculous," he said. "No one gets paid that much for building a wall." But Loki held up a hand. "Wait," he said. And there was something in his voice that made everyone pay attention. "Let's think about this rationally. If you haven't subscribed yet, this might be a good time to hit that button. These stories get more interesting as they go, and you won't want to miss what Loki has in mind." Loki's argument was elegant in its simplicity. The builder wanted payment only if he completed the wall by the first day of spring, but completing such a massive project in 1 winter was impossible. No one, not even a giant with a magical horse, could move that much stone that quickly. "So we agree to his terms," Loki said with a slight smile. "He starts building, works all winter, fails to finish by spring, and we get most of a wall for free." The other gods considered this. It did seem logical. They would get several months of free labor, probably ending up with at least half a wall, maybe more. And when spring came, and the builder inevitably failed to meet his deadline, they could send him away with a pat on the back and a better luck next time. Odin nodded slowly. "We'll need to add some conditions," he said. "No help from anyone else. Just you and your horse. And if you fail to finish by the deadline, you get nothing." The builder agreed immediately, which should have been their first warning that something wasn't quite right. When someone agrees too quickly to terms that seem to favor you, it usually means they know something you don't. But the gods shook hands with the builder, and the deal was struck. As they walked away to plan their new, partially walled future, the builder stood there with his horse, patting Svadilfari's neck and smiling to himself. What do you think the gods had missed in their calculations? Sometimes the most dangerous bargains are the ones that seem too good to be true, and sometimes the most powerful magic is hidden in the everyday rhythm of steady, persistent work. You know how sometimes you think you understand someone, and then they do something that makes you realize you don't know them at all? That's what it was like, living with Loki. Just when the other gods thought they had him figured out, he would reveal another layer of complexity that made them question everything they thought they knew. While the builder began his work on the wall, hammering and chiseling from dawn until well past dusk, Loki seemed unusually quiet. This should have been a warning sign. When Loki was scheming, he got very still, like a cat watching a mouse hole. But the other gods were too busy congratulating themselves on their clever bargain to notice. You see, Loki had abilities that set him apart from the other gods. While Thor could control thunder, and Odin could speak with ravens, Loki could change his shape, not just put on different clothes or grow a beard, but actually become something else entirely. A bird, a fish, a seal swimming in the ocean. He could become smaller than a mouse or larger than a whale. This wasn't magic in the way most people think of magic, with sparks and smoke and dramatic gestures. For Loki, changing shape was as natural as changing clothes. His body would simply flow from one form to another, like water taking the shape of whatever container held it. But here's the thing about shape-shifting that most people don't consider. It's not just about the outside. When Loki became a bird, he didn't just look like a bird. He thought like a bird. He felt the world the way a bird feels it, with hollow bones and the constant awareness of air currents and the magnetic pull of distant places. When he became a fish, the water became his entire universe. He could feel vibrations through his lateral line, sense the chemical traces that other fish left behind, understand the ocean as a three-dimensional space filled with layers of temperature and pressure and possibility. This meant that Loki experienced the world differently than anyone else. While the other gods saw the world from their divine perspective, Loki could see it from 1,000 different viewpoints. He knew what it felt like to be prey, as well as predator, to be small as well as large, to live in the water and the air as well as on land. And right now, as winter settled over Asgard and the builders' hammering echoed across the divine city, not horses in general, but one horse in particular, Svadilfari, the builder's magnificent grey stallion. Loki would often pause in his daily activities to watch the horse work, and what work it was. Svadilfari could pull stones that 20 ordinary horses couldn't budge. He could work for hours without tiring, his powerful muscles never seeming to strain under loads that should have been impossible. But more than that, Svadilfari was intelligent. When the builder needed a particular stone moved to a particular place, the horse seemed to understand without being told. He would position himself exactly where he needed to be, back up to the precise angle required, and wait patiently while the builder attached the harness. Loki began to spend more time near the construction site, not obviously watching but finding reasons to be nearby. He might sit on a hill reading, or tend to some small task that kept his hands busy while his attention wandered to the horse and his work. What he saw concerned him. The builder was making progress faster than anyone had anticipated. The wall was growing with alarming speed, ring by ring around Asgard's perimeter. Each stone fit perfectly with the ones around it, as if they had been carved specifically for their positions. The craftsmanship was flawless. At this rate, the builder might actually finish by spring, and if he finished, the gods would owe him the sun, the moon, and Freyja. The sun and moon were bad enough, but Freyja, Loki was genuinely fond of Freyja. She was one of the few gods who treated him as a complete equal, never making him feel like the outsider he sometimes was. So Loki began to make plans. Not the kind of plans that involved direct confrontation or dramatic gestures. Loki's plans were usually subtler than that, like ripples spreading across a pond from a stone dropped in the center. He started by studying Svadilfari more carefully, the horse's routines, his preferences, his relationships. Because make no mistake, Svadilfari was the key to the builder's success. Without that remarkable horse, the builder was just a very skilled mason who would never finish such a massive project in time. Loki noticed that Svadilfari was, despite his work ethic, still very much a horse. He had the instincts and desires that all horses have. He was attracted to green grass, flowing water, and the companionship of other horses. During breaks in the work, he would lift his head and sniff the air, as if sensing something in the distance that called to him. And Loki, who could become any creature he chose, began to consider the possibilities. What would happen if Svadilfari were distracted at a crucial moment in the construction? What if he were lured away by something more interesting than hauling stones? The plan that formed in Loki's mind was elegant in its simplicity. It required no violence, no theft, no breaking of oaths or bargains. It simply required him to become something he had never been before, and to offer that something as a temporary distraction. As the winter days grew shorter, and the builder's work continued its relentless pace, Loki began to prepare. He would walk alone in the forests around Asgard, practicing his transformation, not just the physical change, but the mental one. learning to think like a creature he had never been, to feel desires he had never felt. It was strange work, even for someone as accustomed to change as Loki was. But then, the strangest solutions often worked the best. While the other gods slept peacefully in their beds, confident that their bargain would work out in their favor, Loki prepared to become something that would change the fate of everyone involved. What kind of creature do you think could distract a horse as powerful and focused as Svadilfari? Sometimes the most effective plans are also the most personal, requiring the planner to become something entirely different from what they were before. There comes a moment in every ambitious project when you realize it might actually succeed. For the gods of Asgard, that moment came on a cold winter night, when they looked out at their growing wall and felt the first stirrings of real concern. The builder had been working for months now, and his progress was nothing short of remarkable. Where once there had been open space around Asgard's perimeter, now there stood a wall that was both beautiful and forbidding. Each stone had been cut and placed with mathematical precision. The mortar between them was so perfectly applied that the seams were barely visible. But it was the pace of construction that truly worried the gods. The builder worked with a methodical efficiency that never seemed to slow down. Every morning he would begin at sunrise, marking out the day's work with measured steps. Every evening he would set down his tools, only when the light became too dim to see properly. And Svadilfari? Well, Svadilfari was like no other horse anyone had ever seen. He could pull loads that should have required a team of oxen. He never seemed to tire, never needed more than brief breaks for water and the occasional handful of grain. When the builder pointed to a stone that needed moving, Svadilfari would position himself without being led, backing up to the exact angle required for the most efficient pull. The sound of their work had become the soundtrack of winter in Asgard. The steady tap-tap-tap of chisel against stone, the scrape of heavy blocks being dragged across the ground, the rhythmic breathing of a horse working at the very limits of what should have been possible, but making it look routine. On this particular night, something changed. Maybe the builder sensed that time was running short. Maybe he realized that the gods were beginning to look nervous. Or maybe he simply decided that the time for normal working hours was over. When the sun set, he didn't stop working. He lit torches and placed them around his work area, creating pools of flickering light in the darkness. The hammering continued, echoing across Asgard, like a heartbeat that never slowed down. The gods gathered on a hill overlooking the construction site, watching with growing unease. "He can't keep this up," Thor muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. They had been saying the same thing for weeks, and yet the builder showed no signs of slowing down. Odin stood with his ravens perched on his shoulders, their black eyes reflecting the torchlight. Hugin and Munin had been bringing him reports from their daily flights, and the news was not encouraging. The builder was not just any craftsman. He was working with techniques and tools that suggested knowledge far beyond what any mortal should possess. "How much of the wall is complete?" Frigg asked, though she probably already knew the answer. "More than half," Odin replied quietly. "If he maintains this pace, he'll finish with time to spare." The implications of this hung in the air like smoke from the torches. The sun, the moon, and Freyja. The price they had agreed to pay seemed like a joke when they made the bargain, because payment seemed impossible. Now it was beginning to feel inevitable. Down at the worksite, the builder moved through his tasks with mechanical precision. Measure twice, cut once, test the fit of each stone before committing to it. Apply mortar with strokes that were identical to the 1,000 strokes that had come before. The work had its own rhythm, its own internal logic that seemed to exist independently of the person doing it. Svadilfari moved through the darkness like a grey ghost, his massive form appearing and disappearing at the edges of the torchlight. When he pulled a load of stones, his hooves struck sparks from the ground. When he stood still, his breathing created clouds of vapor that drifted upward like prayers. The builder talked to his horse in a low, constant murmur, not giving orders, exactly, but sharing thoughts. Commenting on the work, discussing the next day's plans, sometimes just making the kind of meaningless conversation that people have with animals they're fond of. Svadilfari would flick his ears in response, occasionally nickering softly as if offering his own opinions on the construction process. As the night wore on, other sounds began to fade away. The usual nighttime noises of Asgard, conversations in the great halls, the rustle of wind through the world tree's leaves, the distant howl of wolves, all seemed to quiet down, as if the entire cosmos was holding its breath to listen to the steady rhythm of hammer against stone. The gods eventually retreated to their halls, but sleep didn't come easily. How do you rest when you can hear the sound of your fate being constructed outside your window? The hammering continued through the night, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but never stopping completely. By morning, another section of wall had appeared, rising from the ground like a geological formation that had always been there. The craftsmanship was flawless, the design both functional and beautiful. If they hadn't been terrified of the consequences, the gods might have been impressed. Loki, meanwhile, had spent the night making his own preparations. While the builder worked by torchlight, Loki walked in the darkness beyond the construction site, practicing movements that felt foreign to his usual form. He was preparing for a transformation more complete than any he had attempted before. The plan was simple in concept, but complex in execution. He would wait for the right moment when Svadilfari was working alone, or only lightly supervised. Then he would appear in a form calculated to capture the great horse's attention completely, not to harm or steal, but simply to redirect that magnificent focus. Because even the most dedicated worker can be distracted by the right kind of interruption. And even the strongest horse is still a horse, with a horse's instincts and desires and curiosities. As the sun rose over Asgard, illuminating the growing wall, and the builder already back at his steady work, Loki made his final preparations. Today would be the day. Today, the careful construction of winter would meet the wild unpredictability of spring. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an irresistible distraction? Sometimes the most carefully laid plans can be undone by the simplest interruptions. Every great plan depends on understanding what you're really dealing with. The gods thought they understood their situation: a builder, a horse, a wall, and a bargain. But as winter moved towards spring, it became clear that nothing was quite what it seemed. Let's start with the builder himself. The gods had assumed he was simply a very skilled craftsman, perhaps with some minor magical abilities. But as his work progressed, it became obvious that he was something more. The stones he cut were perfectly fitted without measurements. The mortar he mixed never cracked or crumbled. Even in the harsh winter weather, his hands never seemed to suffer from the cold, and his energy never flagged. When he worked by torchlight, the shadows he cast seemed larger than they should have been, as if something much bigger than a man was moving behind the flickering flames. When he lifted stones that should have required machinery, his muscles didn't strain the way human muscles would. He was strong in a way that went beyond normal strength, into the realm of fundamental forces. But it was Svadilfari who really defied explanation. This was no ordinary horse, no matter how magnificent. When he pulled a load of stones, the ground beneath his hooves didn't just compress, it seemed to become more solid, as if the earth itself was cooperating with his efforts. When he breathed in the cold air, frost patterns appeared on nearby surfaces, beautiful and intricate as snowflakes. The other horses in Asgard, the god's own divine mounts, watched Svadilfari with a mixture of respect and unease. They would approach him during his breaks, sniffing curiously, but they never stayed long. It was as if they recognized something in him that was familiar, but not quite right, like meeting a distant relative who looked almost exactly like someone you knew. Loki, who had been studying both the builder and his horse for months now, had begun to suspect the truth. The builder was no mortal craftsman. He was a giant, one of the frost giants from Jotunheim, the realm of eternal winter. And Svadilfari was no ordinary horse. He was a creature of that same realm, shaped by forces that existed long before the gods themselves. This changed everything about the bargain. The gods hadn't made a deal with a skilled tradesman. They had made a deal with one of their ancient enemies, a being whose very nature was opposed to everything Asgard represented: order versus chaos, stability versus change, the warm light of civilization versus the cold winds of the wilderness. And if you're just joining us, this might be a perfect time to subscribe. These Norse myths are full of surprises, and you won't want to miss how this particular trick unfolds. But Loki kept this knowledge to himself, partly because the other gods probably wouldn't believe him without proof, and partly because he had his own plans that depended on timing. Revealing the builder's true nature too early might cause the gods to break their bargain, which would solve the immediate problem but create bigger ones later. Giants had long memories and were not forgiving of broken oaths. No, Loki's solution was more elegant. Instead of breaking the bargain, he would ensure that the builder failed to meet its terms, and the key to that failure was Svadilfari. You see, even giants and magical horses have weaknesses. For all his supernatural strength and endurance, Svadilfari was still fundamentally a horse. He had a horse's instincts, a horse's desires, and a horse's curiosities, and Loki, who could become any creature he chose, was planning to become something that would appeal to those instincts irresistibly. The transformation he had in mind was one he had never attempted before, not just changing his shape, but changing his essential nature, becoming not just female, but becoming the kind of female that would be impossible for a stallion like Svadilfari to ignore. It was a dangerous plan. Shape-shifting always carried risks. The deeper the transformation, the greater the chance that you might not be able to change back completely. And this particular transformation would be deeper than any Loki had ever attempted. He would need to become not just different, but irresistible. As the days passed and the wall grew ever higher, Loki made his preparations. He studied the way mares moved, the way they signaled their interest, the way they played and ran and called to stallions. He practiced the transformation in private, learning to think like a horse, to feel like a horse, to want what a horse would want. The plan was to appear when Svadilfari was working alone, usually in the evening when the builder had gone to fetch more materials. Loki would emerge from the forest as a beautiful mare, call to the great stallion, and then lead him on a chase that would last long enough to disrupt the construction schedule. It wasn't about capturing Svadilfari permanently. It was about creating a distraction significant enough to prevent the builder from finishing on time. One missed day of work might be enough to make the difference between success and failure. But as Loki prepared for his deception, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The builder seemed too confident, too relaxed about his timeline. Even with Svadilfari's help, finishing the wall by spring should have been stressful work, requiring every available hour. Instead, the builder worked with the calm efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much time he had and was certain he could finish with days to spare. It was as if he had calculated not just the physical requirements of the construction, but something else as well, some factor that the gods hadn't considered. What could a giant know about time and seasons that the gods didn't? What advantage might he have that went beyond physical strength and magical tools? As winter moved toward its end, and the crucial moment approached, Loki realized that his distraction might need to be more than temporary. The stakes were higher than anyone had imagined, and the consequences of failure might change the fundamental nature of all the 9 worlds. Sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones who seem to be offering you exactly what you want, and sometimes the only way to defeat such enemies is to become something you never intended to be. There are moments in every story when everything balanced on the edge of a knife could tip one way or another. For Asgard, that moment came on a day when spring felt close enough to touch, but winter still held the world in its grip. Loki had been watching and waiting for weeks, studying the patterns of the builder's work, learning the rhythms of Svadilfari's day. The great horse worked hard, but he also had periods of rest. Times when the builder would go to fetch materials or consult his plans, leaving Svadilfari to graze quietly or simply stand and watch the world around him. It was during one of these quiet moments that Loki made his move. He had chosen a spot at the edge of the forest, where the trees created shadows deep enough to hide his transformation, but open enough for Svadilfari to see what emerged. The change was unlike anything Loki had ever experienced. Usually his shape-shifting flowed smoothly from one form to another, like water finding a new container. This time, the transformation felt more fundamental, as if he was not just changing his body, but rewriting the basic facts of his existence. He became a mare. Not just any mare, but one of extraordinary beauty and grace. Her coat was deep black with a shine like polished obsidian. Her mane flowed like silk in the wind. Her eyes held intelligence and wildness in equal measure. She was everything that might catch the attention of a stallion like Svadilfari, and then some. But more than her appearance, Loki had changed something deeper. He had become genuinely mare-like in ways that went beyond the physical. He felt the world differently, sensed the approach of spring with a horse's awareness of changing seasons. The forest around him was no longer a collection of trees and paths, but a landscape of scents and sounds and possibilities. When Svadilfari lifted his head and saw her standing at the forest's edge, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The great stallion went completely still, every muscle tense with attention. His nostrils flared as he caught her scent on the wind. His ears swiveled forward with laser focus. For a moment, nothing happened. The mare stood gracefully in the dappled sunlight, and the stallion stared at her with the kind of complete attention that horses give to things that truly matter to them. It was as if the rest of the world had simply stopped existing. Then Svadilfari took a step toward her. Just one step, tentative and questioning. The mare responded by tossing her head, and taking a single step backward, not fleeing but inviting. It was the beginning of a dance as old as horses themselves. What happened next was part chase, part courtship, and part pure joy. The mare turned and cantered into the forest, not fast enough to lose the stallion, but fast enough to make him work for it. Svadilfari followed, his massive hooves thundering against the ground as he left behind the construction site, the wall, and his responsibilities. Through the forest they ran, weaving between trees that had stood since the beginning of time. The mare led, always staying just ahead, sometimes pausing to look back with eyes that promised everything a stallion could want. Svadilfari followed, no longer the methodical workhorse, but a creature of passion and desire. Miles passed beneath their hooves. The sun moved across the sky, and back at the construction site, the builder returned to find his essential partner missing, along with any hope of finishing the wall on schedule. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Loki's plan worked too well. The transformation had been so complete, the mare so genuinely enticing, that what began as a calculated distraction became something else entirely. In the depths of the forest, far from the eyes of gods and giants, the mare and stallion came together in a way that would have consequences no one had anticipated. When Loki finally managed to transform back to his usual shape, he was alone in the forest, disheveled and exhausted. Svadilfari had returned to his master, the spell of attraction broken by Loki's change back to his divine form. But something had happened during those hours in the wilderness, something that would not become apparent for months. The immediate plan had succeeded perfectly. The builder, returning to find his horse missing for most of a crucial day, fell behind schedule for the first time since the project began. When Svadilfari returned, they worked frantically to make up for lost time, but the damage was done. The careful timing that had made the impossible seem inevitable was broken. As spring approached and the deadline loomed, it became clear that the builder would not finish the wall in time. The gods watched with relief as the final stones remained unset. The final sections remained incomplete. Their bargain was safe. They would not have to pay the terrible price they had agreed to. But the builder's reaction was not what they expected. Instead of disappointment or anger, he seemed to expand, growing larger and more threatening by the moment. The polite craftsman vanished, replaced by something ancient and furious. His true nature was revealed at last, a mountain giant, one of the firstborn enemies of the gods. "You think you've won?" he roared, his voice like avalanches. "You think your trickery has saved you?" That's when Thor stepped forward, his hammer Mjolnir crackling with lightning. The negotiation phase was over. The builder had revealed himself as an enemy of Asgard, and enemies of Asgard got to meet Thor's hammer up close and personal. The battle was brief, but decisive. When it was over, the builder was gone. Svadilfari had vanished back to whatever realm of winter had spawned him, and the gods were left with 3/4 of a very good wall, and a story they would never live down. But Loki's trick had one more consequence that wouldn't be revealed for months. During that day in the forest, during that wild chase through ancient trees, something new had begun. A life that would be born with 8 legs instead of 4, with the ability to travel between worlds, and with a destiny that would make him the greatest steed in all of creation. Sometimes the most successful tricks are the ones that succeed in ways you never intended, and sometimes the most important consequences are the ones that take months to become apparent. Time moves differently when you're waiting for something extraordinary to happen. The gods of Asgard had settled back into their regular routines after the business with the wall and the builder. Thor had returned to his adventures in Midgard. Odin had resumed his contemplation of cosmic mysteries. Frigg had gone back to her weaving, which was not ordinary weaving, but the kind that influenced the fate of mortals. And Loki? Loki had become unusually quiet. Not the plotting kind of quiet that usually meant trouble was brewing, but a different kind of stillness. He would often be found sitting alone, staring into the distance with an expression that was hard to read. When the other gods tried to engage him in conversation, he would respond politely but briefly, as if his attention was focused on something they couldn't see. Months passed. The seasons turned. The incomplete wall around Asgard stood as a reminder of their encounter with the builder, impressive in its craftsmanship, but forever unfinished. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and the gods would tell the story of the bargain and the trick and the giant's defeat, but they always left out certain details, particularly the specifics of how Svadilfari had been distracted. It was during one of these storytelling sessions that Heimdall noticed something unusual. He was describing the final chase through the forest when he realized that Loki had quietly left the room. This wasn't particularly strange. Loki often came and went as he pleased. but something about his departure felt significant. Heimdall's curiosity got the better of him. Using his exceptional sight, he looked for Loki throughout Asgard. He found him finally in a grove of trees on the outskirts of the divine city, a place that was peaceful and private, but Loki was not alone. Standing beside him was a foal unlike any creature Heimdall had ever seen. It was clearly a horse, but wrong in the most fascinating way possible. Instead of 4 legs, it had 8. Not awkwardly arranged, not clumsy or unnatural looking, but perfectly proportioned for its unusual anatomy. The foal moved with a grace that seemed to defy the basic laws of how legs and bodies were supposed to work together. Its coat was grey like storm clouds, with darker markings that seemed to shift slightly in the light. Its mane was long and silvery, and its eyes held an intelligence that was unsettling in its depth. This was clearly not an ordinary horse, but something entirely new in the world. Heimdall watched as Loki knelt beside the foal, offering it something to eat from his hand. The interaction was gentle, almost tender, like a parent caring for a beloved child. The foal nuzzled against Loki's shoulder with obvious affection. And suddenly, Heimdall understood. The distraction in the forest. The reason for Loki's recent quiet behavior. The source of the foal that should not have been able to exist. This was the consequence of Loki's shape-shifting trick, the result of his transformation into a mare and his encounter with Svedalfari. It should have been impossible. Gods and giants could interbreed, but the offspring of shape-shifting magic and supernatural horses was something entirely theoretical. Yet here was the proof, standing on 8 legs and watching the world with eyes that seemed to see more than they should. Heimdall cleared his throat gently to announce his presence. Loki looked up without surprise. He had probably sensed the Watcher's attention. "So," Heimdall said carefully, "you have a son." Loki nodded. "His name is Sleipnir," he said. "It means slippery or the sliding one." The foal turned toward Heimdall at the sound of his name. His gaze was curious but not fearful. He had the confidence of a creature that had been well cared for and treated with kindness. "The others don't know?" Heimdall asked. "Not yet," Loki replied. "I wanted to be sure he was healthy, that he could manage his unusual anatomy, and I wanted to understand what he might become." As if to demonstrate, Sleipnir took a few steps. His 8 legs moved in a complex pattern that was mesmerizing to watch. It wasn't like any gait that a normal horse would use, but it was perfectly coordinated. He moved across the ground with a smoothness that made it seem like he was floating rather than walking. "He's fast," Loki said with unmistakable pride. "Faster than any horse I've ever seen, and he seems to understand things differently than other animals." Indeed, Sleipnir was watching their conversation with the kind of attention that suggested he was following the meaning, not just the sounds. When Loki spoke about speed, the foal's ears pricked forward eagerly. When he mentioned understanding, Sleipnir seemed to nod slightly, as if agreeing. "There's something else," Loki continued. "Yesterday I saw him standing in a place where he couldn't have walked to, not because it was too far, but because it was somewhere else, as if he had stepped briefly into another world and then back." This was remarkable news. The ability to travel between the 9 worlds was rare even among the gods. Most required the Rainbow Bridge or other magical pathways. But if Sleipnir could move between worlds naturally, he would be unique among all living creatures. The 2 gods watched as Sleipnir explored his grove, occasionally breaking into a trot that was beautiful and strange to see. His 8 legs created rhythms that ordinary horses couldn't achieve, and his speed was indeed extraordinary. But more than that, he moved with joy, the kind of pure happiness that young creatures feel when they discover what their bodies can do. "What will you do?" Heimdall asked. "He can't stay hidden forever." Loki was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose I'll introduce him to his grandfather," he said finally. "Odin has always been interested in unusual horses, and Sleipnir, well, I think he might be exactly what Odin has been looking for, even if Odin doesn't know it yet." As the sun set over Asgard, casting long shadows through the grove, the 3 of them stood together in comfortable silence. The god who had become a mare, the watchman who saw all, and the 8-legged foal who might someday carry the king of the gods across all the worlds. Sometimes the most extraordinary gifts come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes what begins as a trick becomes something far more wonderful than anyone could have planned. Growing up is complicated for any young creature, but imagine how much more complicated it becomes when you have twice as many legs as anyone expects. Sleipnir's early days in Asgard were filled with the kind of adjustments that would have challenged anyone, divine or otherwise. The first challenge was simply learning to coordinate 8 legs instead of 4. You might think this would make him clumsy, but the opposite was true. Once Sleipnir figured out the rhythm of his unusual gait, he could move in ways that defied everything the gods thought they knew about horses. He could run up vertical surfaces by placing his legs at angles that gave him purchase on stone walls. He could change direction instantly while running at full speed, his 8 legs allowing him to pivot and turn without losing momentum. Most remarkably, he seemed to be able to run on substances that shouldn't have supported weight at all: water, air, even the space between stars. Loki spent hours each day with his unusual son, teaching him not just how to move, but how to control his abilities, because it became clear very quickly that Sleipnir's talents went far beyond simply having extra legs. There was the morning when Loki found Sleipnir standing in the middle of a lake, his hooves somehow finding purchase on the water's surface. The young horse was drinking calmly, as if standing on liquid was the most natural thing in the world. When he saw Loki watching, he trotted across the lake to shore, his hooves leaving no ripples behind them. There was the afternoon, when Sleipnir disappeared entirely, not by running away but by stepping sideways into somewhere else. Loki searched for hours before Sleipnir reappeared in exactly the same spot, but with frost on his mane that suggested he had been somewhere very cold for quite a while. And there was the evening when Loki found Sleipnir standing on nothing at all, suspended in the air above the grove, as if the sky itself was solid ground beneath his feet. When Loki called to him, Sleipnir looked down with surprise, as if he hadn't realized he was doing anything unusual. It was time, Loki realized, to introduce Sleipnir to the other gods, not just because the young horse needed more space and stimulation than the grove could provide, but because his abilities were too remarkable to keep secret. And if Heimdall knew about Sleipnir, it was only a matter of time before the others found out anyway. The introduction took place on a morning when the light was particularly beautiful in Asgard, golden and warm with hints of spring. Loki led Sleipnir through the streets of the divine city, where the young horse attracted attention from everyone they passed. The gods had seen many unusual creatures over the centuries: dragons, serpents large enough to encircle the world, wolves that could swallow the sun. But there was something uniquely captivating about Sleipnir. Perhaps it was the way he moved, with grace that made 8 legs seem not just natural but obviously superior to 4. Perhaps it was his intelligence, evident in the way he observed everything around him with curiosity rather than fear. Or perhaps it was simply that he was beautiful. His grey coat had developed silver highlights that caught the light like metal, his mane flowed like liquid mercury, his eyes held depths that suggested wisdom far beyond his age. They found Odin in his high seat, from which he could see all the 9 worlds. The All-Father was in one of his contemplative moods, his ravens perched beside him, his spear Gungnir resting across his knees. When he saw Loki approaching with the 8-legged horse, his single eye focused with the intensity that meant his full attention had been captured. "This," Loki said simply, "is Sleipnir, my son." Odin studied the young horse for a long moment. Sleipnir returned the gaze calmly, showing neither submission nor defiance, just a kind of respectful interest. When Odin extended his hand, Sleipnir stepped forward to sniff it, then allowed the god to touch his neck. "He's magnificent," Odin said quietly. "I can feel the power in him, the potential." What Odin sensed was not just physical ability, though Sleipnir certainly had that in abundance. There was something deeper, a connection to the fundamental forces that held the 9 worlds together. Sleipnir didn't just run between places, he ran between the concepts of places, able to treat distance and dimension as suggestions rather than laws. "Would he let me ride him?" Odin asked. It was a question that required careful consideration. Sleipnir was still young, still learning his own capabilities. And Odin was not just any rider. He was the king of the gods, a being whose very presence carried weight that could crush normal horses. But Sleipnir seemed to understand the question even before Loki could translate it. The young horse moved closer to Odin, lowering his head in a gesture that was clearly an invitation. The first ride was a revelation. Odin had ridden many horses over the centuries, from the swift mounts of the Valkyries to the supernatural steeds that pulled the sun and moon across the sky. But riding Sleipnir was like riding the wind itself, or time, or possibility. They didn't just gallop across Asgard, they galloped across the concepts of space and distance. One moment they were racing through the streets of the divine city, the next they were running along the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, then they were splashing through the rivers of time, and then standing on clouds that supported Sleipnir's weight as if they were solid ground. When they returned, Both rider and horse were exhilarated. Odin's usual serious demeanor had been replaced by something approaching joy. Sleipnir's eyes were bright with the satisfaction of a creature that had finally found its purpose. "He's not just fast," Odin said to Loki. "He's more than fast. He moves through reality itself as if it were landscape." And so began a partnership that would become legendary throughout all the 9 worlds. Odin, the seeker of wisdom and knowledge, riding Sleipnir, the horse who could travel anywhere that existence touched. Together, they would journey to the realm of the dead, to the courts of giants, to the homes of elves and dwarves, and beings whose names were known only to ravens. But that's a story for tomorrow. Tonight, just imagine a young horse with 8 legs, finally understanding what he was meant to become. Sometimes our greatest gifts are the ones that make us different from everyone else. There's something magical about the moment when 2 beings realize they're perfectly suited for each other. For Odin and Sleipnir, that moment came not during their first ride, but during their first real journey together, the kind of travel that would test both horse and rider in ways that staying within Asgard never could. The journey to the Dwarven realm was not one that could be made quickly or easily. It required traveling down through the roots of Yggdrasil, past caverns where ancient things slept, through tunnels that twisted back on themselves like mathematical puzzles. A normal horse, even a divine one, would have needed days to make the trip safely. It began with a problem that required Odin's personal attention. Deep in the realm of the dwarves, master craftsmen who lived beneath mountains and worked with metals that had no names in any other language, a dispute had arisen that threatened to disrupt the delicate balance between worlds. Sleipnir made it in hours. But more than his speed, it was his intuitive understanding of the journey that impressed Odin. When they came to a passage that seemed to lead nowhere, Sleipnir would pause, tilt his head as if listening to something only he could hear, and then choose a direction that led exactly where they needed to go. When they encountered obstacles, chasms too wide to jump, walls too high to climb, Sleipnir would simply alter his relationship with the obstacle. He would run up the wall as if it were level ground, or step onto empty air as if it were a bridge. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand not just where they were going, but why they were going there. When Odin needed to approach the dwarven court with dignity and authority, Sleipnir's gait became measured and ceremonial. When they needed to move quickly through dangerous territory, his 8 legs found rhythms that covered ground faster than thought itself. "We could not forge such a creature," one of them said with honest admiration, "even if we had all the metals of the earth and all the time in the world." The dwarves, who were accustomed to impressive visitors, were nonetheless stunned by the sight of Sleipnir. They gathered around the 8-legged horse, with the appreciation of master craftsmen seeing a work of art that exceeded their own abilities. Another dwarf, older and more experienced, studied Sleipnir's unusual anatomy with professional interest. 8 legs, but perfectly balanced. The bone structure alone should be impossible, but look how gracefully he moves. This is not craftsmanship. This is something beyond craftsmanship. But it was on the journey home that Sleipnir truly proved his worth as Odin's mount. They had resolved the dwarven dispute successfully, but the journey had taken longer than expected. They needed to return to Asgard quickly, because Odin had other responsibilities that couldn't wait. Sleipnir accepted their attention with the calm dignity of a creature that was growing accustomed to being remarkable. He allowed them to examine his hooves, which were harder than steel but somehow made no sound when he walked on stone. He showed them his teeth, which were perfectly formed despite his mixed heritage. He even demonstrated his unusual gait, moving through patterns that the dwarves watched with the fascination of engineers trying to understand a machine that worked better than their theories said it should. Sleipnir's response was to accelerate in ways that defied description. He didn't just run faster, he began to run through space itself, his hooves finding purchase on the structure of reality. They traveled up through the layers of the world tree, not by following paths, but by moving through the connections between places. Odin, who had spent centuries learning to see the hidden patterns that connected all things, watched in fascination as Sleipnir navigated by those very patterns. The horse could sense the threads that linked one realm to another, and use them as roadways that existed in dimensions beyond the usual 3. "Can you run faster?" Odin asked, not demanding but genuinely curious about Sleipnir's limits. They arrived in Asgard, not just quickly, but exactly when they needed to arrive, not early enough to waste time, not late enough to miss their next appointment, but precisely at the moment when Odin's presence was required elsewhere. Word of Sleipnir's abilities spread quickly through Asgard. The other gods were impressed, but more than that, they were curious. Here was a horse that could travel not just between the 9 worlds, but between the concepts that defined those worlds. He could run on water, air, time, space, and possibility itself. Thor, always practical, wondered if Sleipnir could carry passengers other than Odin. The answer, it turned out, was complicated. Sleipnir could carry anyone, but his unusual method of travel required a kind of trust and understanding that not everyone possessed. Riders who tried to control or direct him would find themselves on a very bumpy journey. Those who trusted him completely would experience travel as smooth as floating on calm water. Frigg, with her gift for seeing patterns in fate and destiny, recognized something important about the partnership between Odin and Sleipnir. They complemented each other in ways that made both of them more than they could be alone. Odin's wisdom guided their journeys, but Sleipnir's abilities made journeys possible that no one else could even imagine. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Sleipnir was not his speed or his unusual anatomy, or even his ability to travel between worlds. It was his personality. Despite his supernatural abilities, he remained fundamentally gentle, curious, and kind. He would lower his great head to let children pat his nose. He would stand patiently while the gods discussed complex matters. He would nuzzle against Loki's shoulder with the same affection he had shown as a foal. And Loki watched his son carry the king of the gods across impossible distances, and felt a pride that was both parental and profound. The trick he had played to save Asgard from the giant's bargain had resulted in something far more valuable than a wall. It had given birth to a creature whose abilities would become legendary throughout all the 9 worlds. As the seasons turned and Sleipnir grew from a remarkable foal into the greatest horse in all the worlds, it became clear that his story was just beginning. The 8-legged horse who had been born from Trickery would carry the All-Father across distances that had no names, to places that existed only in legend, on journeys that would become the stuff of stories themselves. If you're enjoying these peaceful stories about Norse mythology, consider hitting that subscribe button. We're almost at the end of our journey with Sleipnir, but there's one more tale to tell. Some partnerships grow stronger with every mile traveled together. For Odin and Sleipnir, each journey across the 9 worlds deepened their understanding of each other, until horse and rider moved as one being with shared purpose and complementary strengths. Their travels began with necessity, but grew into something more profound, a systematic exploration of all existence, guided by Odin's insatiable hunger for knowledge, and made possible by Sleipnir's unique ability to treat the boundaries between worlds as mere suggestions. Picture them now, setting out from Asgard, on a morning when the light seems to stretch across infinite possibilities. Odin sits astride Sleipnir, with the easy confidence of long practice, his blue cloak flowing behind them like captured sky. Sleipnir's 8 legs find their rhythm quickly, each step carrying them not just forward through space, but sideways through dimensions that ordinary horses couldn't even perceive. Their first destination is always different, but the pattern of their travel remains wonderfully consistent. Sleipnir doesn't gallop in straight lines. He moves in curves and spirals that follow the hidden currents connecting one realm to another. When they travel to Midgard, the world of humans, they might arrive by running down a rainbow bridge, or by stepping through a grove of trees that happens to be growing in both Asgard and Earth simultaneously. In Midgard, Sleipnir's hooves make no sound on the ground, allowing them to observe without disturbing. They might watch a farmer teaching his son to plow, or a grandmother telling stories by firelight. Odin collects these quiet moments like other beings collect treasures, understanding that wisdom often lives in the smallest daily acts of human kindness and perseverance. When they visit Alfheim, the realm of the light elves, Sleipnir seems to glow slightly, his grey coat reflecting the ethereal light that suffuses that world. The elves, beings of impossible beauty and musical voices, gather to watch them pass. They sing to Sleipnir in harmonies that make the air shimmer, and the great horse responds by moving in patterns that turn his gait into a kind of dance. Jotunheim, the realm of the giants, requires different skills entirely. Here, Sleipnir's ability to travel through dimensions becomes crucial as they navigate landscapes that shift and change based on the moods of their enormous inhabitants. Mountains that were there yesterday might be valleys today, rivers might flow upward, or sideways, or through colors instead of directions. The giants themselves are not always hostile, but they are always unpredictable. Some greet Odin with grudging respect, remembering old alliances or shared adventures. Others challenge him to contests of wit or strength, which Odin usually accepts with good humor. Sleipnir waits patiently during these encounters, occasionally making friends with giant horses who are amazed by his extra legs, but envious of his ability to run on clouds. In the deep caverns of Nidavellir, where the dwarves work their metal magic, Sleipnir's hooves ring against stone corridors like distant bells. The dwarves have grown accustomed to their visits, and many have become genuinely fond of both rider and horse. They offer Sleipnir special grain that sparkles like crushed gems, and they've made Odin a bridle of silver thread that weighs nothing but glows with soft light in dark places. But perhaps their most remarkable journeys are to Hel, the realm of the dead. This is a place that most living beings cannot reach, protected by rivers of the dead, and bridges guarded by beings older than memory. Sleipnir crosses these barriers as easily as he crosses a meadow, his hooves finding purchase on mist and shadow. In Helth, they move quietly through landscapes of eternal twilight, where the spirits of the dead live lives that are strange echoes of what they knew in life. Odin comes here to speak with ancient kings and forgotten wise women, learning secrets that died with their original keepers. Sleipnir waits in courtyards of grey flowers, sometimes playing with the spirits of horses who remember running in sunlight. The goddess Hel herself, half living and half dead, has developed an unexpected fondness for Sleipnir. She sometimes offers him apples from trees that grow only in her realm, fruit that taste like memories of summer. Sleipnir accepts these gifts graciously, understanding somehow that in this place of endings, small kindnesses matter more than anywhere else. As seasons pass into years, and years into centuries, the bond between Odin and Sleipnir deepens in ways that go beyond words. They develop a communication that happens through subtle shifts in posture, changes in breathing, the slightest pressure of leg against flank. When Odin needs to observe something closely, Sleipnir will slow to a walk so gentle it barely disturbs the air. When urgent news requires swift travel, Sleipnir can sense the urgency and respond before Odin even asks. Other gods sometimes accompany them on these journeys, but never as passengers. Sleipnir has made it clear that he carries only Odin, and Odin alone. Thor has tried to argue, using his usual logic about divine authority and the practical advantages of shared transportation. But Sleipnir simply stands still until Thor gets down, waiting with infinite patience for the thunder god to understand that some partnerships cannot be shared. The most mysterious of their journeys are the ones that take them to places that have no names, realms that exist in the spaces between the official 9 worlds. Here, Sleipnir gallops through forests of crystal trees, across deserts of singing sand, over lakes that reflect not the sky above, but other skies from other times. These are places that exist only temporarily, called into being by the intersection of cosmic forces that most beings never even notice. During one such journey, they discover a realm where time flows backward, and they watch the slow resurrection of a dying star. During another, they find themselves in a place where thoughts become visible, floating like colored lights through air that tastes of dreams. Sleipnir navigates these impossible landscapes with the same calm confidence he shows everywhere else, as if the laws of physics were merely polite suggestions that he's chosen to ignore. If you've been following this gentle journey through Norse mythology, you might consider subscribing to join us for more peaceful tales from the ancient world. These stories of gods and horses, and the quiet moments between grand adventures, can be the perfect companion for your own quiet hours. Back in Asgard, the other gods have grown accustomed to seeing Odin and Sleipnir return from journeys that might have lasted days or moments, depending on which roads they travelled and how time moved in the places they visited. Sleipnir always looks refreshed by their travels, his grey coat gleaming with health, his eyes bright with curiosity about whatever they might explore next. Odin, meanwhile, carries the knowledge he has gathered, like seeds that will eventually grow into wisdom. The conversations he has had with spirits in Hel inform his understanding of living mortals in Midgard. The songs he has heard from elves in Alfheim give him new perspectives on the music that dwarves make with their hammers in Nidavellir. Sometimes on quiet evenings when no urgent business calls them away from Asgard, Odin and Sleipnir will take short rides around their home realm. These are not journeys of exploration but of contentment, chances to enjoy the familiar sights and sounds of the divine city they both love. Sleipnir will trot through gardens where golden apples grow, past fountains that sing with voices like crystal bells, along pathways that glow with their own inner light. During these peaceful rides, they often encounter Loki, who watches his son and the Allfather with expressions that mix pride, wonder, and something that might be called satisfaction. The trick he played so many years ago to save Asgard from the giant's bargain has grown into something he never could have imagined, a partnership that has become central to the functioning of all the 9 worlds. The wall that was never finished still stands around Asgard, three-quarters complete and somehow perfect in its incompleteness. It serves its purpose of keeping out unwanted visitors, but its unfinished nature also serves as a reminder that the most important solutions often come from the most unexpected places. As twilight settles over all the worlds, and the stars begin to appear in skies that stretch across dimensions, Odin and Sleipnir continue their eternal travels. They move through landscapes of dream and reality, carrying messages between worlds, gathering wisdom like flowers, and strengthening the connections that hold all existence together. Tonight, perhaps they are galloping across fields of starlight, or walking quietly through a forest where the trees whisper secrets in languages older than thought. Perhaps they are standing on a mountain peak that exists in three worlds simultaneously, watching the dance of aurora that paints stories across the cosmic sky. Wherever they are, they move together with the grace of perfect understanding, the eight-legged horse and the one-eyed god, exploring mysteries that have no end, and finding joy in the simple fact of shared journey through the infinite possibilities of existence. And so our gentle journey through Norse mythology comes to a peaceful end, with the image of a horse unlike any other, carrying his rider across worlds beyond counting, their friendship a reminder that the most extraordinary adventures often begin with the simplest acts of trust and understanding. Sleep well, travelers. Let these ancient stories carry you into your own peaceful dreams, where perhaps you too might ride across impossible landscapes on horses made of starlight and possibility.